The mountain temple stood timeless, embraced by mist and ancient trees whose gnarled roots clung to the earth like the hands of time itself. The air carried the scent of damp earth and incense, swirling with the echoes of whispered prayers. Here, in this secluded place where the world seemed to slow, the restless found refuge, the weary found solace, and the lost came in search of something they could not name. One such traveler arrived just as the autumn sun cast long golden streaks through the trees. He was a man of middle age, shoulders slightly hunched beneath the weight of burdens unseen. His steps were measured yet uncertain, like someone who had wandered far but had yet to find his destination. His name was David, and though he did not know exactly why he had come, something deep within him had guided his path here. As he stepped through the temple gate, the gentle chime of a wind bell greeted him, its sound crisp and clear against the morning air. He paused for a moment, his eyes taking in the stillness around him, the fallen leaves blanketing the stone path, the soft murmur of a nearby stream, the distant sound of a wooden gong signaling the passing of another hour. There was a quiet reverence to this place, as if time itself had bowed in deference to the wisdom held within these walls. In the courtyard, an elderly monk was sweeping leaves into a neat pile, his movements slow but deliberate. His robe, once deep saffron, had faded with time, just as the lines on his face had deepened with years of contemplation. His silver hair was pulled back in a simple knot, and his eyes, calm and steady, held the depth of a man who had long since ceased to chase the world. Sensing the presence of the visitor, the monk paused, resting his hands on the worn wooden handle of his broom. He studied the man before him, not with judgment, but with quiet understanding, as if he could already see the tangled thoughts that had brought him here. "What is it that you seek, my friend?" the monk asked, his voice carrying the softness of falling leaves. David hesitated, as though the question had pulled something loose within him. He had spent years searching for success, for meaning, for something that would quiet the storm in his mind. Yet standing here, in the presence of this old monk, his answer felt both simple and impossible. "I seek peace," he finally said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The monk nodded, as if he had heard these words countless times before, but instead of answering, he turned his gaze to the trees, watching as a single leaf detached itself from a high branch and drifted slowly to the ground. "Peace," the monk said at last, "is not something you will find. It is something you must learn to cultivate." David frowned, unsure if he understood. He had always thought peace was a place, something external, something waiting to be reached. Master Min, sensing the unspoken question, gestured toward a nearby wooden bench beneath a great Bodhi tree. "Sit with me," he said, his voice kind but firm. "Let me share with you what I have learned." David sat, the weight in his chest shifting, not lighter, but different. He did not yet have the answers he sought, but for the first time in a long time, he was ready to listen. And so, beneath the ancient tree that had witnessed the passing of countless seasons, the old monk began his lesson. The first habit, practicing mindfulness master. Min sat quietly for a moment, allowing the morning breeze to weave its way through the trees. The world around them was alive. The rustling of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the rhythmic rise and fall of the wind. But within the temple walls, everything felt still. David watched the old monk, waiting for him to speak. But instead, Master Min simply closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, as if drawing the entire moment into himself. "Tell me, David," the monk finally said, his voice as steady as the earth beneath them. "Where is your mind right now?" David blinked. The question seemed simple, yet something about it unsettled him. His mind was everywhere, flitting between worries of work, regrets from the past, and an uncertain future he could not yet see. Even now, as he sat in this tranquil place, he was not truly here. I I don't know," he admitted, his voice tinged with frustration. Master Min smiled, as if he had expected this answer. He reached down and picked up a smooth stone from the ground, rolling it gently in his palm. "A mind untrained is like a river in a storm," he said, his eyes fixed on the stone, turbulent, restless, carried away by every current. But a mind trained in mindfulness is like this stone, still, grounded, present. He handed the stone to David, who turned it over in his fingers, feeling its cool weight. Mindfulness is not about silencing the mind, the monk continued. It is about learning to observe, to see your thoughts as passing clouds, your emotions as waves on the ocean, not something to control, but something to witness with gentle awareness. David frowned. But how do I do that? My thoughts never stop. Master Min chuckled softly. Neither does the wind. But do you fight the wind? Or do you simply let it pass? He gestured toward a small tea set placed beside them. Lifting the teapot, he slowly poured a stream of golden liquid into a cup. David watched as the tea filled the small ceramic vessel, his eyes following the gentle ripples that formed on the surface. This is mindfulness, Master Min said, setting the pot down. Simply being present, feeling the warmth of the cup in your hands, tasting the tea fully instead of drinking absent-mindedly, breathing, noticing, allowing each moment to exist just as it is. David picked up the cup and cradled it between his palms. The warmth seeped into his fingers, grounding him in the present moment. For the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to simply sit, without reaching for his phone, without planning his next move, without being anywhere but here. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to peace. Master Min nodded approvingly. Mindfulness is not a destination, David. It is a practice, a way of being. And the more you cultivate it, the more you will come to see. Peace was never something you had to search for. It was always here, waiting for you to notice it. David closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, just as the monk had done earlier. The air smelled of earth and incense, of autumn leaves, and something else. Something quiet, something vast. For the first time, he truly arrived. The second habit, cultivating gratitude. The tea had grown cold in David's hands, but he hardly noticed. His mind lingered on Master Min's words, the weight of them settling deep in his chest. Mindfulness, being present, was not something he had ever truly practiced. His life had been a constant pursuit, always chasing the next milestone, the next goal, never stopping long enough to appreciate what he already had. As if sensing his thoughts, Master Min gently set his cup down and looked toward the horizon. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting a golden glow over the temple grounds. Do you know the greatest thief in life, David? The old monk asked. David frowned. Time. Master Min shook his head. No, it is the belief that what you have is not enough. David's lips parted slightly, but no words came. The monk continued. We spend so much of our lives thinking about what we lack, what we wish we had, what we think will finally make us happy. But in doing so, we overlook the simple abundance already present in our lives. He picked up a single fallen leaf, holding it delicately between his fingers. Gratitude is the art of seeing what is already there, rather than always looking for what is missing. David let out a breath, slow and measured. I suppose I haven't been very good at that. Master Min smiled knowingly. Most people aren't. It is easier to count our problems than our blessings. But tell me, David, when was the last time you truly felt grateful? David hesitated. Of course, he had said thank you countless times in his life. But had he ever really felt it? He searched his memory, and suddenly, an image surfaced. His daughter years ago, running toward him with open arms after he returned from a long work trip. trip. The warmth of her embrace, the way she had buried her small face into his chest, the overwhelming feeling that, in that moment, nothing else in the world mattered. His throat tightened. He had been so busy providing for his family that he had forgotten to truly be with them. Master Min observed him in silence, then said softly, "Gratitude is not a reaction, David. It is a practice, a way of seeing the world." He gestured toward the temple garden, where a young novice monk knelt in the soil, carefully tending to the roots of a flowering plant. Even the simplest things can become a source of gratitude. The air in your lungs, the warmth of the sun on your skin, the kindness of a stranger. The more you recognize these small blessings, the more you will realize how much you already have. David exhaled slowly, nodding. "How do I start?" Master Min folded, his hands in his lap. "Begin each morning with a single thought. I am grateful for this day." At night, before you sleep, recall 3 things, no matter how small, that brought you joy. Do this daily, and watch how your heart begins to change. David looked down at the tea in his hands, now just a reflection of the sky above. He had spent years searching for fulfillment, never realizing that it had been woven into the fabric of his everyday life. Gratitude was not something to be found. It was something to be awakened. And for the first time in a long time, David felt something stir within him. The 3rd habit, developing compassion. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, painting the temple grounds in hues of amber and crimson. A hush settled over the trees, as if the world itself was listening. David, too, listened, his heart lighter than when he had arrived, yet still carrying a weight he could not name. Master Min studied him for a long moment before speaking. "David, tell me, when was the last time you truly looked into another person's eyes and saw their suffering?" David hesitated. He had seen suffering, of course. In the tired faces of his colleagues, in the silence between him and his wife, in the loneliness of his aging parents. But had he ever truly seen it? Had he ever allowed himself to step inside another's pain, to hold it, even for a moment? Master Min's gaze was steady. "Compassion," he said, "is not just feeling sorry for someone. It is the ability to see yourself in them." He reached into the pocket of his robe and pulled out a small, time-worn pebble. Holding it between his fingers, he turned it slowly. "This stone," he said, "has been shaped by time, by water, by the weight of the world pressing upon it. And so have we. Every person you meet carries a story, a burden, a quiet sorrow they may never speak of. Compassion is the willingness to acknowledge that we are all shaped by the same forces." David exhaled, staring at the pebble in the monk's hand. "But what if someone has hurt me?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Master Min placed the pebble on the bench between them. "A man once came to me, carrying a heavy stone. He held it tightly and said, 'This is my pain. I cannot let it go.' I asked him, 'Does the stone hurt you? Or is it the act of holding it that causes pain?' David swallowed hard. He had spent years carrying his own stones, resentments, disappointments, wounds that had never fully healed. The monk continued, "Compassion does not mean we excuse the harm done to us. It means we understand that those who hurt others are often carrying their own suffering. To meet pain with kindness instead of anger, this is how we free ourselves." David thought of his father, a man hardened by years of struggle, whose love had always been buried beneath silence and expectation. He had spent a lifetime resenting him, never once considering the burdens his father might have carried. Master Min placed a hand over his own heart. "The greatest act of compassion," he said softly, "is learning to hold your own suffering gently. When you do this, you will find it easier to hold others with the same kindness." David looked down at the stone on the bench. It was small, light. It would be so easy to let go. And maybe, just maybe, he was finally ready to. The fourth habit, letting go of attachments. The temple courtyard was bathed in the soft glow of dusk. A few golden leaves drifted lazily from the Bodhi tree above, surrendering themselves to the breeze without resistance. David watched them fall, mesmerized by their effortless descent. Master Min followed his gaze and smiled. "The leaves do not grieve when they let go, David," he said gently. "Why do we?" David exhaled, rubbing his hands together as if warming them against a cold he could not shake. "Because we're afraid of losing what we love," he admitted. The monk nodded. "That is the great paradox of life, isn't it? We hold on to things, people, success, memories, believing they belong to us, but nothing truly does." He reached down and picked up one of the fallen leaves, twirling it between his fingers. Everything we cling to is like this leaf. It was never meant to stay forever, and yet we resist its falling, as if our grasp can change the nature of things. David's chest tightened. He had spent years gripping tightly, clinging to his youth, his achievements, his relationships, terrified of what would happen if he loosened his hold. "But if we don't hold on, won't we lose what matters?" he asked. Master Min chuckled softly. "Tell me, David, have you ever tried to hold water in your hands?" David frowned, unsure of what he meant. "If you clench your fist around it," the monk continued, "it slips through your fingers, but if you keep your palm open, the water remains." David swallowed hard. "So, we should just stop caring?" Master Min shook his head. "No, my friend. To love without attachment does not mean to love less. It means to love fully, without the fear of loss. To cherish what is here, without demanding that it never change." David thought of his daughter, of how he had always worried about the day she would grow up and no longer need him the way she once had. He had been so afraid of losing the closeness they shared that he had gripped it too tightly, unknowingly pushing her away. The old monk placed the leaf in David's hand. "What if, instead of holding on, you simply appreciated? What if you loved without possession, without fear?" David traced the delicate veins of the leaf, feeling the truth settle deep in his chest. Letting go did not mean losing. It meant trusting. Trusting that love, once given, never truly disappears. He looked up at Master Min and, for the first time, felt the weight in his heart begin to lift. The wind stirred, and another leaf fell between them. This time, David did not reach for it. He simply watched it go. The fifth habit, practicing forgiveness. Night had begun to settle over the temple, casting long shadows across the stone pathways. A soft breeze carried the scent of incense through the air, wrapping the courtyard in its gentle embrace. David sat in silence, staring at the leaf in his palm, lost in thought. Master Min studied him quietly before speaking. "There is something you are still carrying, isn't there?" David let out a slow breath. "I've let go of many things, but some wounds, they don't heal so easily." The monk nodded knowingly. "That is because you have mistaken letting go for forgetting." David's brow furrowed. "Aren't they the same?" Master Min shook his head. "Forgetting buries pain. Forgiveness transforms it." He picked up a small, cracked clay bowl resting beside the tea set and turned it slowly in his hands. "A long time ago, there was a man who came to this temple carrying great anger. He had been betrayed by someone he once trusted, and no matter how much time passed, the wound remained. One day, he asked me how he could make the pain disappear." Master Min ran his fingers over the jagged crack in the bowl. "I told him, 'You are like this bowl. It was once whole, but it was dropped, and now the crack remains. No amount of wishing will undo it, but instead of throwing it away, what if you filled the crack with gold?'" David frowned. Gold, the old monk smiled. There is an old Japanese practice called kintsugi, the art of mending broken pottery with gold, honoring the cracks rather than hiding them. It turns something broken into something even more beautiful. He set the bowl down gently. Forgiveness is our kintsugi. It does not erase the wound, but it allows us to mend it with wisdom, compassion, and understanding. And in doing so, we become stronger, not in spite of our pain, but because of it. David swallowed, feeling something shift inside him. But what if the person who hurt me doesn't deserve forgiveness? Master Min gave him a long, searching look. Then, give it anyway. Not for them, but for you. David felt his throat tighten. He had spent years holding on to old betrayals, nursing his wounds as if they were proof of what had been done to him. He had convinced himself that forgiving meant excusing, that it meant letting someone off the hook. But maybe forgiveness was about freeing himself. Master Min leaned forward slightly, his voice softer now. You have carried this burden long enough, David. Put it down. Let the cracks be filled with gold. David closed his eyes, his hands curling around the cracked bowl. And for the first time, he considered what it might feel like to finally be free. The sixth habit. Cultivating generosity. The temple lamps flickered softly, casting warm pools of light onto the stone courtyard. Night had fully arrived, wrapping the monastery in its quiet embrace. David sat with Master Min, the cracked bowl still resting in his hands. He traced its golden seams with his fingertips, his mind lingering on the monk's words about forgiveness. Master Min reached for the teapot and began pouring another cup, his movements unhurried, graceful. As the fragrant liquid filled David's cup, the old monk smiled. A full cup can only be of use if it is shared. David glanced down, watching the steam rise. You mean generosity? Master Min nodded. Tell me, David, have you ever given something without expecting anything in return? David hesitated, then shrugged. I suppose. I donate to charity when I can. I help friends when they need me. The monk smiled. And when you give, how do you feel? David thought for a moment. Good, I suppose. But sometimes, I wonder if it really makes a difference. Master Min lifted the teapot again, pouring himself a small cup. Many years ago, a beggar came to this temple. He began. He was starving, exhausted, and had nothing to give. A young novice monk, barely more than a boy, saw him and, without hesitation, broke his own meal in half and shared it. He took a slow sip of tea before continuing. Years later, that same beggar returned, but he was no longer a beggar. He had found work, built a life, and had come back not to take, but to give. He became one of the temple's greatest benefactors. David exhaled. All because of one meal? Master Min set his cup down and nodded. Kindness multiplies. A single act, given with an open heart, ripples outward in ways we may never see. David looked down at his hands, thinking of all the times he had been too preoccupied to give. Not just money, but time, patience, love. He had always assumed generosity was measured in grand gestures, but perhaps its truest form was much simpler. A warm meal, a kind word, a moment of presence. Master Min smiled, as if reading his thoughts. Generosity is not just about giving things, David. It is about giving yourself. When you listen deeply, when you offer kindness without condition, when you open your heart freely, you create abundance, not just for others, but within yourself. David nodded slowly, feeling something settle in his chest. He reached for his cup of tea, and this time, as he lifted it to his lips, he did so with a newfound awareness. He had always thought of giving as something he did for others, but now, he realized, true generosity was a gift to himself as well. The seventh habit. Practicing mindful communication. The night deepened, draping the temple in stillness. The flickering lanterns cast shifting shadows against the wooden beams, their soft glow reflecting in David's untouched cup of tea. He had been listening to Master Min all evening, absorbing each lesson like parched earth drinking in the rain. But now, the monk's gaze settled on him with quiet intent. "Tell me, David," he said, "when was the last time you truly listened?" David blinked. "I listen all the time," he replied. "To my colleagues, my family." Master Min held up a hand, stopping him gently. "No, I did not ask when you last heard someone. I asked when you last listened." David opened his mouth, then closed it. A memory surfaced. His wife speaking. To him at the dinner table, her voice soft but distant. He had nodded, given the usual responses, but his mind had been elsewhere. At work. On emails. On the next thing he needed to do. Had he truly been there with her, or had he just been there? Master Min smiled knowingly. "We speak often, but we rarely connect. We listen, but we do not hear. Words are like the wind, David, passing through unless we are present enough to catch them." He lifted the teapot, once more, pouring another cup of tea with careful, deliberate movement. The liquid streamed out in a steady flow, uninterrupted, filling the empty space of the cup with ease. When we listen with presence, we create space, like this cup. When we interrupt, judge, or think of our next response while someone speaks, we are like a cup that is already full. There is no room left to receive. David exhaled, his shoulders sinking slightly. "I never thought of it that way." Master Min chuckled softly. "Most of us don't. We are too busy forming replies, too caught up in our own noise. But true connection begins with silence, with the willingness to let another person's words exist fully before we respond." David thought of the arguments. He had had times when he had spoken in frustration, not to understand, but to be heard. Times when he had filled the space with words instead of listening to what lay beneath them. Master Min set his teacup down gently. "The next time someone speaks to you, listen as if it is the only thing that matters, not just to their words, but to their pauses, their tone, the emotions beneath them. Listen with your whole being." David nodded slowly, his mind quieting in a way it hadn't before. He had always assumed communication was about speaking well, but now, he realized, perhaps the greatest skill of all was knowing when to be silent. And, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to listen. The 8th habit, prioritizing self-care. Cool breeze drifted through the temple courtyard, carrying with it the faint scent of sandalwood and jasmine. The night was deep now. The sky stretched in infinite darkness above them. The conversation had slowed, but David felt no urge to leave. For the first time in years, he wasn't restless. He wasn't thinking about tomorrow. He was simply here. Master Min took a slow breath, stretching his hands as if releasing an unseen weight. "Tell me, David," he said, "when was the last time you rested?" David gave a tired chuckle. "I sleep every night." The monk smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something knowing. "I did not ask when you last slept. I asked when you last truly rested." David's smile faded. He thought about the nights spent staring at the ceiling, his body still, but his mind racing with to-do lists and unfinished business. The mornings where he woke more exhausted than when he had laid down. He thought about the way he pushed through, fatigue, always telling himself he would rest later. But later never seemed to come. Master Min picked up a nearby lantern and tilted it slightly. The oil inside was nearly gone, the flame flickering weakly. "A lamp cannot burn without oil," he said simply. "Oh, neither can you." David swallowed hard. "But if I stop, if I slow down, there are things that won't get done." The old monk studied him, then smiled gently. "And if you burn yourself out completely, who will do them then?" Silence stretched between them. Master Min turned the lantern upright again, then continued. Caring for yourself is not selfish, David. It is necessary. You cannot pour from an empty cup. You cannot care for others, do meaningful work, or even find peace if you are running on empty. David exhaled, rubbing his temple. He had always believed that rest was something to be earned, that he had to justify taking care of himself. But now, sitting here in the quiet of the temple, he wondered how much of his exhaustion had been self-inflicted. How do I start? He asked quietly. Master Min's expression softened. Start small. Give yourself permission to rest. 2. Sit in stillness, even for a few minutes a day. To take a walk without thinking of your destination. To breathe without rushing to the next thing. Your well-being is not an afterthought. It is the foundation upon which everything else rests. David nodded slowly, his mind turning over the thought. Self-care was not a reward. It was a responsibility. As the monk gently blew out the flame, in the lantern, David felt something inside him shift. Something that had been burning too fast, for too long, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to exhale. The 9th habit, embracing imperfection. The night was still, wrapped in a silence so deep that David could hear the faint rustling of leaves as they drifted to the ground. He sat beside Master Min, feeling lighter, yet more exposed, like a stone polished smooth by the current of their conversation. The old monk, sensing David's quiet reflection, reached down and picked up a simple clay bowl resting beside the tea set. It was old, its surface marked by cracks that had been carefully mended with thin veins of gold. David tilted his head. That's the second time I've seen a bowl like that tonight. Master Min smiled. It is the same bowl. He turned, it slowly in his hands, the gold shimmering in the lantern light. Do you remember what I told you about kintsugi? The art of mending broken things with gold? David nodded. That forgiveness doesn't erase wounds. It transforms them. The monk's eyes twinkled. Yes, and the same is true of imperfection. We are all cracked in some way, David. We carry regrets, flaws, mistakes. The world teaches us to hide them, to smooth them over, to pretend we are whole. But Buddhism teaches us something else. He traced a finger along the golden seam of the bowl. Imperfection is not something to be ashamed of. It is what makes us unique. David looked down at his own hands. He thought about the mistakes he had made, the harsh words spoken in anger, the moments he had failed those he loved, the regrets that gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night. But what if my flaws have hurt others? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Master Min set the bowl between them. Then you mend them, not by pretending they were never there, but by acknowledging them, learning from them, and allowing them to make you wiser. The monk gestured toward the tree above them, its branches twisting unevenly toward the sky. Do you see this tree? It is not perfectly straight. Some branches are broken. Some bend in odd directions. And yet, is it not still beautiful? David followed the monk's gaze, seeing the tree in a way he hadn't before. It was not perfect, but perhaps that was what made it so alive, so real. Perfection is an illusion, Master Min continued. A life spent chasing it is a life spent in suffering. True peace comes when we embrace the cracks, the scars, the imperfections, and see them not as failures, but as part of our story. David let out a slow breath. He had spent so much of his life trying to fix himself, trying to be something more, something better. But what if he had been whole all along? Cracked, mended, imperfect, yet completely enough. For the first time, he looked at himself with softer eyes, and the cracks no longer seemed like something to hide. The 10th habit, cultivating equanimity. The night had settled fully now. The sky stretched vast and endless above them. scattered with stars that shimmered like distant lanterns. A deep stillness blanketed the temple grounds, as if the world itself had exhaled. David watched the way Master Min sat, his posture effortless, his presence unwavering, like a mountain unmoved by the passing wind. There was a quiet strength in him, a steadiness that David longed for but had never quite grasped. Sensing his thoughts, the old monk spoke. "David, do you know what it means to be at peace? Not just in moments of quiet, but in the midst of life's storms." David exhaled slowly. "I don't know if I've ever truly felt that." Master Min nodded, as if he had heard this before. Most people mistake peace for the absence of struggle, but life does not grant us that luxury. Equanimity is not found in avoiding the waves, but in learning to ride them. He reached down and picked up a small bowl of water, placing it between them. "Look at this water," he said, lightly tapping its surface. Ripples formed, spreading outward, but the water quickly stilled. The mind, when trained, is like this. It may be disturbed, but it always returns to stillness. David leaned forward. "But how do you stop the waves from coming?" Master Min smiled. "You don't." He set the bowl aside. "You stop fearing them." David frowned slightly. "But what about pain, loss, anger? How can we not be affected?" The monk gestured toward a bamboo grove swaying gently in the wind. "Do you see those trees? They do not resist the wind. They bend, but they do not break. This is equanimity, not rigidity, but flexibility. When we accept life as it is, rather than how we wish it to be, we free ourselves from suffering." David was silent, his thoughts unraveling like a knotted thread. He had spent so much of his life trying to control everything, his success, his relationships, even his emotions. But what if peace had never been about control at all? Master Min's voice softened. "Life will bring joy, and it will bring sorrow. Both will pass. The question is, can you remain steady through it all?" David inhaled deeply, letting the night air fill his lungs. He thought of the moments that had once shattered him, the times he had fought against what was, rather than embracing it for what it meant to be. Perhaps peace was not about changing the world. Perhaps peace was about learning to be steady, unshaken, like the mountain, and as free as the wind. And, for the first time, he felt it. Not as something distant, something to chase, but as something already within him, waiting to be still. The temple grounds had grown quiet, wrapped in the deep stillness of the night. The air was cool, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and incense. David sat beside Master Min, feeling the weight of the evening's conversation settle into his bones, not as a burden, but as something else, something lighter. For so long, he had been searching for peace, for meaning, for some elusive feeling of contentment that always seemed just out of reach. He had spent his life chasing achievements, proving his worth, gripping tightly to the things he feared losing. And yet, here in this quiet temple, with nothing but the sound of rustling leaves and the presence of an old monk, he had found what had always escaped him. Not because the world had changed, but because, for the first time, he had. Master Min looked at him with kind eyes. "What have you learned, David?" David took a breath, feeling the crisp night air fill his lungs. He thought about the lessons of the evening, each one settling into place like stones on a path. Mindfulness. That peace was not in the future, not in some distant goal. It was in now, in the way a single breath could anchor him, in the way a cup of tea could bring him back to the present. Gratitude. That he had spent so much time wanting more that he had forgotten the abundance already in his life. Compassion. That everyone carried unseen burdens, and to judge less and love more was the only way to truly connect. Letting go. That clinging to things, people, expectations, Even pain was like holding sand too tightly in his fist. The tighter he gripped, the more it slipped away. Forgiveness. That he was not freeing others by forgiving them. He was freeing himself. Generosity. That giving did not just change the receiver, but the giver as well. Mindful communication. That true connection was not in speaking well, but in listening deeply. Self-care. That he had neglected the one person who needed his kindness the most. Himself. Imperfection. That the cracks in his life were not flaws to be hidden, but golden seams that told the story of his journey. And finally, equanimity. That life would never be without struggle, but peace was not found in avoiding the waves. It was found in learning to stand in the storm without fear. David let out a slow breath and met Master Min's gaze. "I have spent my life searching for peace," he said, never realizing it was something I had to create within myself. The old monk smiled, his eyes twinkling like the stars above them. "And now you understand." David looked around. The same temple, the same night sky, the same wind weaving through the trees, and yet everything felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because finally he had. Master Min stood, his movements slow, unhurried. Peace is not something you find in a temple, David. It is something you carry with you, wherever you go. David rose to his feet, feeling lighter than he had in years. As he stepped toward the temple gate, he turned back one last time. The old monk stood beneath the Bodhi tree, his silhouette steady against the lantern's glow. "Thank you, Master Min," he said softly. The monk only smiled. "Go well, my friend." And as David stepped into the night, he no longer felt lost. He was exactly where he was meant to be. End of story.